It began on a quiet Tuesday morning in a suburban neighborhood that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. The kind of place where freshly mown lawns, pastel-colored mailboxes, and beige stucco homes painted a picture of tranquility. But as many homeowners would eventually discover, appearances could be deceiving. My street had a rhythm, a predictable ebb and flow of activity. The school bus came at 7:30 sharp. The mail carrier walked the same route every afternoon, and neighbors tended to their gardens like clockwork. I had lived there for 5 years without incident, maintaining my property meticulously, planting seasonal flowers in neat beds, and occasionally nodding to familiar faces during my morning coffee runs. Until the driveway incident. That morning, I had woken early, determined to reorganize my garage and move my car to a spot that made access to the yard more convenient. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would raise eyebrows, just a normal homeowner task. The sun was low, casting a soft golden hue over the neighborhood, and I was humming to myself as I pulled my car forward, intending to temporarily block my own driveway while I shifted a stack of boxes. It seemed simple enough. Unbeknownst to me, this act would trigger the chain of events that transformed a mundane morning into an ordeal that would involve law enforcement, neighborly confrontation, and a summons I never expected. My car sat half in the driveway, half on the curb, a small, temporary obstruction. I assumed the situation was obvious to anyone passing by. My own property, my own car, my own responsibility. But, as is often the case in these neighborhood dramas, perception and reality rarely aligned. The first hint that things were about to escalate came when I noticed a neighbor across the street observing me intently. She was well-dressed, immaculate as always, a person whose attention to detail extended beyond her own property. She had earned a reputation in the neighborhood, not for friendliness or warmth, but for an unwavering vigilance over the rules, whether they were HOA regulations, city codes, or her own personal interpretations thereof. This was Karen, though no one called her that aloud. Everyone knew her as the woman who never let anything slip through the cracks. At first, I paid her little mind. People watch, people judge. I was used to it. But she didn't simply watch. Within minutes, she had stormed down the street, heels clicking sharply against the pavement, phone in hand. It was a purposeful march, the kind that left no doubt she had a mission, and the direction was clear, toward my driveway. By the time she arrived, I had finished moving one stack of boxes and was preparing to drive my car back into its usual spot. She didn't wait for an explanation or a casual greeting. Instead, she launched immediately into action, snapping photos, gesturing toward my car, and waving her phone as if she had already dialed someone. In her mind, she had likely caught a violation in progress, a blatant affront to neighborhood standards, a moment that demanded official intervention. I tried to reason with her, waving my hands and pointing out that it was my own driveway and my own car, that this was temporary, that no other vehicles were impeded. She paused briefly, then shook her head, muttering something I couldn't quite hear, her expression a mixture of disbelief and righteous indignation. Her phone stayed up, capturing angles, close-ups, perhaps even documenting the sunlight hitting my vehicle just wrong. It was as if she were assembling evidence for a trial that hadn't yet been called. Moments later, the unmistakable wail of a siren pierced the calm suburban air. A police cruiser turned the corner with lights flashing. The sight of it made my stomach knot. I had dealt with traffic stops and minor incidents before, but never this, being reported for blocking my own driveway. An officer stepped out, a composed figure in a crisp uniform, and began to approach. I greeted him, explained the situation succinctly, but the presence of the neighbor and her phone complicated the narrative. Karen was adamant, pointing and speaking quickly, her words a rapid-fire stream of accusations, obstruction, violation, irresponsibility. I showed the officer the context, the boxes, the temporary placement, the fact that this was my property. He listened politely, jotting down notes, but the neighbor's insistence created tension. What was intended for a 5-minute chore had become an escalated scenario that now involved law enforcement. Even as I moved my car to unblock the driveway, the officer remained, partly out of caution, partly to document the neighbor's complaints. The encounter was awkward, a dance of civility and assertion. After what felt like an eternity compressed into minutes, the officer thanked me for my cooperation and left, leaving Karen standing there with her phone. She wasn't satisfied. Her attention was unrelenting, her determination unshaken. In her mind, she had not just reported an infraction, she had delivered justice. But in the aftermath, a new complication arose. Days later, I received a formal notice, a summons to my command office, not for a parking violation, but for a review related to neighborhood conduct and reported disturbances. Apparently, my temporary driveway blockage combined with Karen's documentation had triggered a bureaucratic escalation I hadn't anticipated. The notice was official, stamped and sealed. The language was precise, outlining the time, location, and expectations. Reading it, I felt a mix of disbelief and mounting concern. How had a simple, routine task spiraled into something requiring formal proceedings? My mind raced through the events, retracing the steps, the gestures, the photos, and the unexpected persistence of my neighbor. It seemed surreal, almost cinematic, as if my morning had been a prelude to an entirely new story in the world of suburban oversight and vigilant neighbors. And so, what began as a minor inconvenience, a momentary obstruction in my own driveway, had evolved into a pending summons, the first chapter of a confrontation I didn't ask for, but was now undeniably part of my life. The stage was set for something far larger than a single car, a single driveway, or a single complaint. The neighborhood had rules, yes, but sometimes it seemed the enforcers of those rules had their own narratives, narratives that could intersect with your life in ways you never expected. With the official notice in hand, and the day stretching ahead, I realized this was only the beginning. What seemed like a trivial, isolated incident was about to grow, expand, and involve layers of bureaucracy, community tension, and the kind of scrutiny that makes even mundane suburban life feel like a high-stakes drama. I was about to step into a world I hadn't chosen, yet could not ignore. And as I looked out my window toward the familiar street, I knew one thing. The Karen from across the road was not finished, not by a long shot. The day ended with a quiet tension, a neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, but under the surface, a storm was brewing. The driveway, once a simple, functional space, had become a symbol of control, a flashpoint for conflict, and a catalyst for what would unfold next. The summons awaited, and with it, a confrontation I couldn't yet fully imagine.
The envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a silent harbinger. Its weight was heavier than any piece of paper should feel, stamped with the insignia of authority and printed in a tone that brooked no argument. Summonses rarely arrive for trivial infractions, and yet here it was, my name, my address, and a time I was expected to appear at the command office. The words felt surreal, almost theatrical, as if I had wandered unwittingly into a drama meant for someone else. The driveway incident, fleeting and mundane in my mind, had officially crossed into officialdom. For the next few days, a strange combination of anxiety and anticipation settled over me. Every sound outside my home, the snap of a branch in the wind, the hum of passing cars, the distant bark of a dog, seemed loaded with meaning. I found myself glancing toward my street, half expecting Karen to appear at any moment, phone in hand, ready to document my next move. Her presence, once a mere annoyance, had now transformed into a psychological weight. I felt watched, evaluated, and preemptively judged, all without a single word exchanged between us. The neighborhood itself seemed altered. Lawns were still trimmed, mailboxes still painted in cheerful shades, but every routine gesture, a jogger crossing the street, a neighbor walking their dog, was subtly tense, as if everyone were aware of the incident and waiting to see how it would unfold. I realized that in these communities, drama has a ripple effect. One small spark, one temporary blocked driveway, could ripple outward, affecting not just those directly involved, but an entire ecosystem of suburban observers. I tried to maintain normalcy. Coffee in the morning, a run to the corner store, a brief chat with neighbors who hadn't yet been infected by the tension. Yet my own behavior betrayed me. I found myself avoiding the driveway, moving cars earlier than necessary, and even hesitating before taking out the trash, worried that any action might be misinterpreted. The summons had shifted the balance. I was now hyper-aware, acutely conscious of how easily ordinary life could become extraordinary under the gaze of someone determined to enforce rules. Meanwhile, Karen's activity did not abate. She was visible more often than before, seemingly performing an unspoken patrol. At times, she would appear at the end of her driveway, leaning slightly forward, phone in hand, eyes scanning the neighborhood as though she were collecting data for a private investigation. At first, I thought it coincidental, but over time, the pattern became unmistakable. Her watchfulness was calculated, methodical, and designed to provoke a heightened sense of self-surveillance. Every glance felt like a subtle warning. The next infraction could be worse than a simple complaint. I began documenting everything: notes, photos, timestamps, an ironic echo of Karen's own obsessive recording. I told myself it was for my own protection, a way to establish a factual timeline should the situation escalate. Yet there was an unspoken tension in doing so, a feeling of being drawn into the very behavior I had once observed with mild amusement. The lines between neighborly caution and paranoia were blurring. When the day of the summons finally arrived, I felt a nervous anticipation that bordered on dread. I drove to the command office early, parking at a respectful distance, trying to appear calm and cooperative. The building itself was unremarkable: beige concrete, large glass doors, and a handful of official vehicles parked out front. Yet inside, it radiated a sense of authority, a reminder that this was no longer a neighborhood dispute, but a matter now acknowledged by a higher power. The waiting area was filled with people, some seated quietly, others engaged in hushed conversations. There was a subtle hierarchy, an unspoken understanding of who belonged and who was there under scrutiny. As I took a seat, I noticed other faces, each reflecting varying levels of apprehension, indignation, or resignation. Some appeared to be in positions of authority, while others seemed caught up in administrative crossfires, much like I now was. The air was charged with expectation, a quiet tension that seemed to vibrate beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. Eventually, a clerk called my name. The walk through the office was slow, deliberate, each step echoing off the linoleum floors. My mind raced with possibilities. Would this be a formal reprimand, a lecture on neighborhood decorum, or would it be more subtle, a review, a negotiation, a chance to assert control over my own narrative? Every instinct told me that the outcome was uncertain, that in matters of bureaucracy, appearances and narratives could matter more than facts. Inside the office, I was greeted by an officer who, while professional, carried an unmistakable air of procedural authority. He asked me to recount the events surrounding the driveway incident, prompting me to provide context, timelines, and intent. I explained everything with as much clarity and calm as possible: the temporary blocking of my own driveway, the movement of boxes, and my assumption that no violation had occurred. I presented my documentation, photographs of the driveway before, during, and after the incident, and notes that outlined the sequence of events. Yet even as I spoke, it became clear that the situation had already developed a life of its own. Karen's documentation had established a narrative, one in which I appeared negligent, obstructive, and resistant to community standards. The officer's expression was neutral, but the subtle weight of the paperwork in front of him and the careful phrasing of questions hinted that my side, while noted, might not carry the same authority as the evidence provided by the neighbor. It was a strange inversion. The person who had created the problem from a place of rigid enforcement seemed to hold more influence than the person whose property was at stake. After what felt like hours, but was likely less than 30 minutes, the officer concluded the session. He explained that the report would be reviewed, that my cooperation was noted, and that further action might be taken depending on the outcome of internal discussions. The language was polite, but it carried a subtle warning. The neighborhood's scrutiny did not end at the boundaries of my driveway, and my actions, however innocent, were now part of a documented history. Returning home, the weight of the summons lingered. The driveway no longer felt like a mere access point for vehicles. It had become a symbol of oversight, a stage upon which disputes over control, perception, and community standards played out. By the evening, I found myself back at my window watching the street bathed in the soft glow of sunset. Karen was nowhere to be seen, but her influence lingered. The house across the street appeared quiet, but I knew that tomorrow could bring her back armed with her phone and her sense of mission. I realized that in this neighborhood, peace was conditional, and normalcy was fragile. Every action, every movement carried potential consequence. The first chapter of the official proceedings had ended, but the story was far from over. The summons was not merely a bureaucratic formality. It was an invitation into a deeper, more complex engagement with the neighborhood, a challenge to navigate the unspoken rules and the vigilant eyes of those who believed in absolute adherence to their own vision of order. And as darkness fell over the street, I knew that the next chapter was already in motion, that the true escalation had yet to begin, and that the delicate balance of suburban life could shift in the blink of an eye.
The days following my visit to the command office were a peculiar mixture of relief and tension. On one hand, the formal meeting had concluded without immediate penalties or fines. On the other hand, a subtle but unmistakable sense of scrutiny had settled over my home like a thin layer of frost. Every movement outside, every car pulled into the driveway, every package left on the porch seemed magnified under the imaginary lens of surveillance. Karen, now more than ever, occupied the center of this lens, her presence both literal and psychological. It was a Saturday morning when the real escalation began. I had stepped outside to water my flower beds, a mundane weekend task, when I noticed an unfamiliar figure in the distance, clipboard in hand, moving deliberately from house to house. Their gait was purposeful, authoritative, and completely detached from the casual weekend rituals of joggers or dog walkers. As they approached my home, I immediately recognized the insignia of the HOA. The Homeowners Association, once a peripheral presence in the neighborhood, quietly sending newsletters or reminders, had arrived with a mission, and judging by the clipboard and their meticulous note-taking, it was not a friendly visit. The HOA representative circled my property as if cataloging every detail, from the alignment of the mailbox to the angle of the garden gnome on the lawn. I had maintained my home meticulously, but I also knew that perfection was never enough when someone had a checklist and an agenda. Every little deviation, whether a stray leaf, a slightly crooked welcome mat, or a tire mark on the driveway, was potential fodder. The experience was disorienting. I had expected neighbors to gossip or complain. I had not expected an organized, formalized audit that could weigh against me in a documented fashion. As the representative completed his inspection, he noted minor infractions, a slightly overgrown hedge, a few weeds creeping along the walkway, and a small crack in the driveway. Each observation, while trivial, was recorded in a neat, systematic manner, ready to be compiled into a report. I realized that in the context of this neighborhood, minor imperfections were amplified into evidence of negligence or disregard for communal standards. The driveway incident had been a spark. The HOA's presence was now a tinderbox waiting for any misstep to ignite a formal escalation. Karen, of course, was never far from the narrative. I noticed her leaning slightly out of her window, phone in hand, observing the HOA's actions with an intensity that suggested she had orchestrated this visit behind the scenes. Whether or not she had, I could not confirm, but her timing was impeccable and her satisfaction palpable. She had shifted from vigilant neighbor to indirect architect of oversight, and I had become the subject of a scrutiny network I didn't ask to join. By the end of the inspection, the representative left, promising that a written report would follow and that further meetings might be required. The report arrived a few days later, formal in tone, listing each minor infraction alongside recommendations for compliance. It was clear that the HOA, like Karen, viewed my actions and property through a lens of rigid expectation. The driveway incident, while noted as resolved, had placed me on a figurative watch list, a designation that ensured every future action would be filtered through suspicion. In the meantime, my own routine began to change under this heightened awareness. I approached gardening with precision, measuring plant spacing and trimming edges with surgical care. I aligned my cars in exact spots, photographing each arrangement for my records. The psychological weight was tangible. The neighborhood, once familiar and predictable, now felt like a stage, with every homeowner's movement potentially observed, recorded, and judged. Even simple tasks like retrieving the mail or walking the dog became exercises in careful choreography. Karen's influence continued to expand. She began attending HOA meetings regularly, her reports and observations gaining attention and credibility among the board members. It became apparent that she had not merely complained about a driveway, but had initiated a form of neighborhood governance in which her interpretations of rules held weight. I could sense that my position as a homeowner, once autonomous and independent, was gradually being eroded, replaced by a reality where adherence to her standards dictated the rhythm of life. Then, the inevitable happened. I received a notice from the HOA requesting a formal meeting regarding compliance concerns and community standards. The letter was polite, but the subtext was unmistakable. My conduct, my property, and my interactions with neighbors were now officially under review. It was an escalation beyond the police summons, beyond casual observation, a formal, structured confrontation designed to assert authority and redefine boundaries. The meeting itself was a carefully orchestrated exercise in procedural drama. I arrived at the HOA office, greeted by the familiar clipboard, folders, and a panel of board members who wore expressions of measured authority. Each member had read Karen's reports and reviewed the documentation from my driveway incident. The discussion was entirely narrative-driven. Facts were recounted, timelines reiterated, and interpretations debated, all without a single raised voice, but with an intensity that felt suffocating. Every word, every gesture, every attempt to explain context was measured against a pre-existing narrative constructed by my neighbor and corroborated by HOA standards. By the time I left the meeting, it was clear that the situation had shifted permanently. My actions were no longer private, my property no longer entirely my own, and the concept of ordinary life, watering plants, moving a car, unloading boxes, had transformed into an exercise in compliance. Karen's influence had extended into institutional authority. Her narrative merged with formal oversight, and I was left navigating the tension between autonomy and external scrutiny. Returning home, I realized that the street itself had changed in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Neighbors who had once been casual acquaintances now walked with heightened awareness, aware that the HOA was active and that violations, real or perceived, carried consequences. My driveway, the origin of this drama, was no longer a functional space. It had become a symbol of oversight, a touchpoint for conflict, and a reminder that in this neighborhood, even minor actions could spiral into elaborate confrontations. As night fell, I stood by my window, looking out across the quiet street. Karen's house was dark, but I could almost feel her presence, the lingering gaze of vigilance that had orchestrated much of this escalation. The HOA's actions had confirmed a new reality. The neighborhood operated on rules that were selectively enforced, influenced heavily by one determined individual, and my life had become entwined in a cycle of observation, documentation, and potential confrontation. The first two chapters, police involvement and official scrutiny, had set the stage. Now the HOA had expanded the battlefield, and I understood that the true drama was just beginning. Every future movement, every small decision would be influenced by the awareness that one neighbor's vigilance could ripple through layers of authority, shaping perception and consequences in ways I could not yet fully predict. The stage was set for the next act, a deeper, more complex engagement with control, compliance, and the relentless pursuit of perceived order. And as I turned away from the window, the quiet hum of the neighborhood at dusk belied the storm that was gathering just beyond the manicured lawns.
By the time the sun fully disappeared behind the rooftops, the neighborhood felt like it had been draped in a heavy cloak of unease. Evening lights flickered on one by one, casting warm squares of yellow across neatly trimmed lawns. But even those familiar comforts couldn't soften the tension threading through the cul-de-sac. The residents sensed something was wrong, something deeper than typical HOA squabbles or neighbor disputes. They hadn't seen the details, but they'd felt the shift. Conflict had a way of radiating outward, unsettling even the uninvolved. Inside my home, the atmosphere felt sealed, insulated, and waiting. The fake citations were stacked on my dining table, each one more unhinged than the last. The mailbox sticker and the clumsy tracking device lay nearby, documented, ready to become exhibits if this ordeal escalated into a legal matter. And based on her behavior, it was almost guaranteed that it would. The only question was how far she would go. As night settled deeper, I checked the locks, front door, back door, side gate, which I normally did without thought, but that night, the final click of each lock felt symbolic, like consciously drawing borders that should never have been crossed in the first place. My garage remained the true center of the conflict, sealed behind the new internal lock I'd installed. It felt like a fortress, a defiant reclamation of autonomy, but it also felt like a beacon for the kind of person who couldn't stand being told no. Around 10 o'clock, the quiet began to distort. It started with the scraping sound. Subtle at first, faint enough to be dismissed as a stray animal or wind dragging fallen branches across the pavement. But it repeated, slower, deliberate, the kind of sound that didn't belong to nature, but to human hands interacting with something they shouldn't. I moved to the window overlooking the driveway, careful with my steps across the living room floor. The blinds were slightly parted, allowing just enough of a sliver to see outside without revealing myself. There she was. Her figure stood near the garage, partially illuminated by the spill of street lamp light. She wore dark clothing, a choice that was as impractical as it was incriminating. Her posture was hunched, focused, her hands working with objects I couldn't fully see from my angle. She moved with the restless energy of someone carrying out a plan fueled not by strategy, but by obsession, single-minded, frantic, unraveling. It took only a moment for me to recognize her intent. She wasn't just trying to get into the garage, she was trying to break in. The audacity would have been infuriating if it hadn't been so deranged. There, in the middle of the night, she pressed tools against the side door lock, tugging and prying, as though sheer force could overpower hardened steel. And each time the lock resisted, she grew more aggressive, her movements sharper and more erratic. This wasn't about parking anymore. This was about control, and she was losing it. Her fixation had crossed into dangerous territory. Every scrape of metal against metal echoed her desperation. Every frantic gesture betrayed a mind unraveling under the weight of consequences she had built for herself. I documented it all. My phone recorded the scene in crisp detail, the forced entry attempt, the trespassing, the tools in her hand. There was no ambiguity left, no interpretation needed.
She had chosen this escalation. She had willed it into existence. But she didn't stop at the lock. After several failed attempts, she paused, stepping back in frustration. Her silhouette wavered, shifting as though she were wrestling with what to do next. And then she made another choice, one far more volatile. She moved toward the side of the house. For reasons only she understood, she had convinced herself that the answer to reclaiming her imaginary authority lay in pushing further. She followed the side path between our properties, the narrow walkway swallowed by deep shadow. Her steps were quiet but determined, the kind of steps driven by entitlement rather than reason. She reached the gate, another barrier she wasn't supposed to pass, and tried it. Locked. That only seemed to stoke her anger. She tugged, hard. The metal rattled in its frame, the noise cutting through the quiet of the neighborhood like a warning bell. I watched from another window, documenting each step, each action. Her persistence bordered on mania. She didn't just tug, she shook the gate violently, as though the sheer force of her indignation should cause it to yield. When that failed, she turned back toward the garage. Her pacing became quicker, her body rigid with frustration. She stared at the locked side door as though it would expect it to magically surrender. And then she noticed something. Below the siding, tucked against the concrete foundation of the home, sat a small rectangular vent. It was nothing unusual, a standard opening for airflow, too small for a person, but large enough to catch her attention for reasons that defied logic. She knelt down. She reached toward it. What she intended to do became clear in an instant. She was trying to tamper with the wiring inside the wall cavity. It was reckless, dangerous, a bizarre leap in logic that made sense only through the lens of someone spiraling out of control. Her unguarded actions revealed just how fractured her mindset was. Her movements were feverish, almost frantic as she attempted to manipulate electrical components she clearly didn't understand. I recorded every second. But the true turning point came when her clumsy interference produced a sudden spark, small, sharp, enough to make her jolt backward. It wasn't enough to injure her, but it was enough to jolt her with a reality she had been avoiding. She was playing with fire, literally and figuratively. For the first time that night, she hesitated. Her frantic movements stilled. Her posture changed, a flicker of fear crossing through her body language. She pulled her hand back from the vent as though it would expect it to bite her again. The silence that followed was suffocating. Eventually, she retreated, slowly, cautiously, backing away from the garage, then the street entirely. She walked like someone trying not to acknowledge the gravity of what she had just attempted, her steps hollow, her composure cracked beyond repair. She disappeared into her home, leaving behind the faint scent of scorched insulation and the echo of her unraveling. That night, the neighborhood slept uneasily, and I lay awake knowing one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop. Until she was forced to.
By the next morning, the entire neighborhood felt the aftershock of her late-night attempt to break into my garage, even though most residents hadn't witnessed the act itself. Communities have a way of absorbing tension through shared spaces, driveways, sidewalks, the slow parade of recycling bins rolled to the curb. People sensed the shift, the disturbance, even without knowing its cause. But evidence of her intrusion appeared quickly enough. The faint scorch mark near the vent, the scratches on the side door frame where she had pried and pulled, the disturbed gravel along the pathway leading to the gate, and perhaps most incriminating of all, the way she moved through the neighborhood that morning with a jittery stiffness, as if afraid someone might confront her, or worse, as though she feared someone had seen everything. The truth, of course, was that someone had. And I carried the proof in the form of video clips exported and neatly organized into a digital folder titled Unauthorized Entry Attempts, Evidence. I spent the early hours gathering documentation, time-stamped video, photographs of the tools she dropped near the gate, images of the vent she had tampered with, the HOA's previous acknowledgement of her forged notices,
Everything had been meticulously arranged, compiled like chapters in her own undoing. It wasn't revenge, it was protection, a record for when the situation inevitably rose beyond neighborhood gossip. By mid-morning, the rumor mill stirred. It always did. A few neighbors lingered longer than usual near their mailboxes. Others paused on their walks, casting glances toward her property, then mine. Subtle, hesitant, curious. They knew something had escalated, even if they didn't yet know the specifics. And the person at the center of that curiosity, the self-appointed warden, sensed their attention. Her curtains twitched every time someone passed. Her car remained conspicuously parked in her driveway, the boot clamp still attached like an orange badge of consequences. She didn't attempt to remove it again, not in daylight, not under the watchful eyes of the community she once controlled through intimidation. But she was not the type to retreat quietly. Around noon, an HOA emergency meeting was convened. It was rare for the HOA to respond to anything quickly. Usually, issues simmered for weeks before becoming agenda items buried somewhere between landscaping updates and budget reviews. But this situation had bypassed the usual slow drip of bureaucracy. The combination of forged documents, boundary violations, and attempted break-ins forced them into action. The meeting was held in the community center, an unassuming building normally used for craft fairs and holiday potlucks, but that day it felt like a courtroom, its atmosphere thick with anticipation. Word had spread faster than the HOA wanted, and more residents attended than chairs available. Some stood against the walls, others leaned in doorways. Everyone waited for answers. The HOA board spoke first, their expressions tense, their voices unusually firm. They explained the situation in careful, measured terms: unauthorized use of property, forged HOA communications, nighttime trespassing, and apparent attempts to manipulate electrical wiring on another resident's home. They avoided names, but everyone knew. A ripple spread through the room, quiet shock, murmurs of disbelief, but beneath the shock lay a deeper emotion: vindication. Many residents had endured her overbearing behavior for years. She had patrolled the streets with a clipboard, issued passive-aggressive notes onto car windshields like a self-declared sheriff of sidewalks. They had tolerated her because tolerating her felt easier than confronting her. But now her actions had crossed into something the community could not ignore. When the board finished speaking, they opened the floor for residents to share concerns. People stepped forward one by one, quietly at first, then with more confidence. Stories emerged. Old grievances resurfaced. Patterns became clear. This wasn't a single incident, it was a culmination. And through it all, I stayed silent. I didn't need to speak. The evidence spoke for itself. The community was already awake. Across the room, she sat stiffly in a metal folding chair, arms crossed so tightly it seemed as though she were trying to hold herself together. Her expression flickered between disbelief and fury, her posture rigid, her gaze darting from speaker to speaker, as though waiting for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one did. Not one resident spoke on her behalf. She shifted uncomfortably, her confidence unraveling as the collective burden of her behavior finally landed squarely on her shoulders. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, like a pillar crumbling under the weight of a truth she had long ignored. The board then announced the consequences. The forged documents had triggered legal involvement. The attempted break-in would be investigated by local authorities. She would receive a formal cease and desist order. And while the HOA couldn't evict her, private associations held no such power. They could revoke privileges, impose fines, and seek restraining measures if her behavior continued. The room held its breath. And then, in a single moment that sealed her fate, she stood from her chair and stormed out of the building. No words, no rebuttals, just the echo of footsteps and the metal clang of the door swinging shut behind her. The HOA meeting dissolved in a wave of low conversation. Residents lingered, swapping their own experiences with her. A sense of collective relief washed through the room, as though a fog had lifted. But the story wasn't done. because when I returned home later that afternoon, something unexpected awaited me. A package sat on my porch, plain brown cardboard, no return address, no labels. It was unusual for deliveries to arrive, but this one felt out of place. It wasn't scheduled, I hadn't ordered anything, and given everything that had happened, caution pressed against my instincts. Inside, packaged neatly between layers of bubble wrap, lay an object that made the entire situation take a sudden and chilling turn. It was the spare garage door remote I hadn't seen in weeks, the same one I had thought I'd misplaced, the one she must have taken long before I installed the new lock. The implications were unsettling, not only because she had stolen it, but because she had returned it, quietly, secretly, without any confrontation. This wasn't an apology, it wasn't remorse, it was something far more disturbing. A message. And as I held the remote, cold in my hand, I realized something, absolute certainty. She wasn't finished.
The weeks following the HOA hearing brought a cautious calm to the neighborhood. The formal warning had been issued, the documentation had been filed, and the psychological intensity that had defined the prior months began to ease, at least superficially. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions persisted, like ripples across a pond long after a stone is sunk. The driveway, once a mundane fixture of suburban life, now carried symbolic weight, a reminder of the intricate interplay between personal autonomy and communal scrutiny. Life slowly resumed its routines, but with an acute awareness that everything I did was observed, evaluated, and potentially recorded. I continued documenting activities around the property, not out of fear alone, but as a form of preparation, a strategy to reclaim agency. Every photograph, every timestamp, every note became part of a larger framework, a buffer against future escalations, and an assertion of my right to context and clarity. The balance between vigilance and normalcy was delicate, requiring constant attention, yet it became a form of empowerment in its own right. Karen's presence, while still noticeable, shifted subtly. She continued her observational habits, but the formal warning had tempered some of her influence. Her documentation was no longer automatically validated by institutional authority, and her role as arbiter of neighborhood standards was slightly diminished. It was a nuanced change, almost imperceptible to casual observers, but significant for those directly involved in the conflict. Her vigilance persisted, yet it now existed within a framework that recognized limits, boundaries, and accountability. The HOA, too, adjusted its approach. Follow-up inspections became less frequent, and notices were framed more constructively rather than as implicit threats. The community had witnessed the escalation, the procedural review, and the resolution, and there was an unspoken understanding that minor conflicts could no longer be amplified without context or justification. The formal structures of oversight remained, but they now existed alongside a clearer delineation of fairness and procedure. I, for my part, reflected deeply on the experience. The driveway incident, a seemingly trivial matter, had acted as a catalyst, exposing the mechanisms by which perception, narrative, and influence could converge to shape reality. It revealed how minor actions, when viewed through the lens of vigilant observation and institutional authority, could escalate into complex social and bureaucratic dramas. More importantly, it highlighted the importance of documentation, context, and measured response when navigating such environments. Interactions with neighbors returned to a semblance of normalcy, though they were subtly altered by the recent events. Casual greetings were accompanied by a shared understanding that boundaries had shifted, that autonomy carried responsibility, and that vigilance was an accepted part of neighborhood life. Karen, while still present and observant, became one among many, her influence now tempered by the processes and experiences that had unfolded. The street regained its rhythm, its patterns familiar, yet permanently marked by the prior months of scrutiny and conflict. The driveway itself returned to its intended purpose, a functional space for vehicles, a point of access to the home, and a reminder of the saga that had unfolded. Every time I parked my car, I was conscious of the past events, yet also aware of the resilience and agency I had reclaimed.
The concrete, the borders of the property, and the physical space were no longer just functional, they were symbolic markers of autonomy, vigilance, and the subtle balance of power within a community. In the evenings, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications of the experience. Communities, I realized, are defined not only by their physical structures, but the narratives, expectations, and interpersonal dynamics that shape daily life. Rules and standards exist, yes, but the interpretation and enforcement of those rules can create tension, challenge autonomy, and test patience. The experience illuminated the fragile line between order and overreach, between vigilance and intrusion, and between conflict and resolution. Ultimately, the driveway incident became a story of adaptation, resilience, and awareness. I had navigated police involvement, HOA scrutiny, neighbor surveillance, and institutional processes, emerging with both insight and a renewed understanding of boundaries. Karen, while persistent, had revealed the limits of influence when balanced against documentation, clarity, and measured response. The neighborhood had shifted subtly, a landscape now marked by the echoes of oversight, but also by the capacity for fairness, resolution, and coexistence. As night fell, I stood once more by the driveway, gazing across the quiet street. The homes glowed softly in the lamplight, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the neighborhood, once a stage of subtle conflict, now carried the calm of restored equilibrium. The driveway, my car, and the garden were once again mine to manage under the watchful but bounded eyes of neighbors in the HOA. What had begun as a simple temporary obstruction had grown into a multi-layered experience of social dynamics, authority, and personal resilience. In the end, life continued, shaped but not defined by the events of the past months. The story of the driveway, the police involvement, the HOA scrutiny, and Karen's vigilance had concluded, not with grand confrontation, but with careful navigation, strategic documentation, and the quiet assertion of personal autonomy. The neighborhood remained a community, with all its rules, personalities, and expectations intact, yet the balance of oversight and independence had been clarified, leaving space for both vigilance and ordinary life to coexist. And so, the saga closed where it began, in a quiet suburban street with a driveway that was no longer merely a driveway, but a symbol of endurance, observation, and the subtle art of surviving and thriving in a neighborhood defined by scrutiny, standards, and the occasionally overzealous watchfulness of one determined neighbor.